Hey, tonight we'll travel back over 700 years to a time when most people had never traveled more than a few miles from where they were born, when literacy was rare, and when looking up at the sky wasn't a curiosity, it was a source of fear. This is a story about how people in the Middle Ages understood the sky, about how they interpreted stars, comets, and eclipses, and how those beliefs shaped the choices they made in their daily lives and in times of crisis. Before we begin, let me know in the comments, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it as you settle in? Are you lying in bed, taking a quiet moment on the couch? And if you enjoy this kind of slow, historical storytelling, consider liking this video and subscribing. It helps us keep going. It's the year 1263. In most of Europe, the average person had no formal education. They couldn't read Latin, and they had never seen a map of the Earth, let alone the solar system. Scientific knowledge existed, but it was limited to monasteries, universities, and a few royal courts. Even there, it was mixed heavily with religion, superstition, and classical ideas dating back to ancient Greece. To the common person, the sky wasn't just a background to daily life. It was a place of meaning. The idea of a heliocentric model, that the Earth revolved around the sun, wouldn't appear in serious form until the 16th century. In the 13th century, people believed in the geocentric view, that Earth stood still at the center of the universe, and everything, the sun, the moon, the stars, revolved around it in perfect spheres. This model came from the works of Ptolemy, combined with religious teachings. The sky was made up of fixed layers: the moon, the planets, the sun, and the stars, each embedded in a crystal sphere. Beyond that was heaven. So when something unusual happened in the sky, a comet, a lunar eclipse, or a star that seemed to move strangely, it wasn't seen as a natural event. It was seen as a message, sometimes from God, sometimes from darker forces. People believed eclipses could bring disease, war, or famine. In some regions, eclipses were linked with the death of kings or the downfall of cities. Even highly educated churchmen would sometimes treat them with caution, gathering people to pray when the sun turned dark. Comets, in particular, caused fear. They were called hairy stars, and their sudden, unpredictable appearance made them feel unnatural. Chronicles from the time often link comets with real events: the death of rulers, the outbreak of plague, or great fires. Whether these events were truly connected didn't matter. What mattered was the timing. And timing was everything. In a small Bavarian village in 1263, these beliefs would have shaped daily life. There were no calendars on the wall, no accurate timekeeping. Seasons were tracked by the church's holy days, and the moon was used to plan planting, harvests, and even childbirth. If a lunar eclipse appeared, as it did in July of that year, families might light candles, cover mirrors, or gather to pray. Some would believe that demons or spirits were loose. Others would fast for days, asking for protection. To the modern listener, these reactions may sound strange, but to them, it was a form of survival. In a world where explanations were few, interpretation was how people made sense of the unknown. And in one of those small villages, a man named Alaric had begun to ask quiet questions. He was not a priest, not a noble, just a scribe's assistant in a monastery on the edge of the woods. He copied texts, he sharpened quills, he prepared inks, but more than that, he looked up. Alaric had seen the eclipse, he had heard the rumors, but instead of fear, he had felt curiosity. And curiosity in the Middle Ages was sometimes the most dangerous thing of all. In the monastery of St. Eberhard, not far from the Rhine, Alaric spent most of his hours hunched over parchment. He wasn't a monk, not yet. He had taken no vows, worn no habit, but he was allowed to work in the scriptorium, a cold stone room where daylight poured through narrow windows and silence was sacred. His task was simple: to copy old texts, scripture mostly, psalms, sermons, hagiographies, but sometimes, mixed in with the prayers and lives of saints, were ancient manuscripts, Greek and Arabic works, translated and passed down, often heavily censored, but still bearing traces of unfamiliar ideas. That's where he first read the name Aristotle, and then Al-Farabi, Averroes, Ptolemy. These names weren't spoken aloud in the halls. The monks were cautious, even suspicious of foreign knowledge. But the pages didn't hide. And Alaric, in his quiet way, began to wonder, what if the stars weren't divine messages, but distant, burning stones? What if the earth didn't sit still, unmoving? He didn't ask these questions aloud. Not yet. But he started noticing. On certain nights, when the sky was clear and work had ended, Alaric would slip out past curfew. He'd walk beyond the walls into the open field behind the orchard and look up. No telescopes, no charts, no tools. Just eyes and a growing sense that something wasn't right. The stars didn't always behave. Some moved faster than others. Planets, or wandering stars as they were called, would retrograde, shifting backward unexpectedly. Eclipses came, but not always with disaster. Comets appeared, but sometimes nothing followed. Why did the stars not align with the fears? Why did the sky not obey the stories? In the scriptorium, he found a passage, one likely overlooked by the others, from an old copy of a lost Roman treatise, barely legible. We earth may not be at the center, for it casts a shadow that moves. It was vague, probably wrong, but it stayed with him. That week, Alaric did something bold. He copied the passage into a small parchment scrap and hid it beneath his bedding. He began watching the moon more carefully, tracking its phases, noting its distance from certain stars. He made crude marks on bits of wood and stone, lining them up from night to night. He wasn't sure what he was doing. He didn't think of it as science, but it felt like something true. And more than that, something his own. Still, whispers in the abbey were changing. Another novice, a boy named Matthias, had seen Alaric outdoors at night. He'd mentioned it during morning prayer. And the prior, a stern man named Brother Ulrich, had started asking small questions. Do you sleep well, Alaric? Why does your ink seem unfinished lately? What draws you to the stars? The questions weren't threats. Not yet. But in the 13th century, curiosity wasn't always seen as a virtue. To question the heavens was to question the order of the world. And the church did not take kindly to disorder. That autumn, the sky changed. It began with a faint glow, a reddish hue that crept along the northern horizon just after dusk. By the third night, it had spread higher, a shimmering curtain of scarlet, pulsing like a slow heartbeat. Villagers whispered of omens. The monks called for prayer. They had no name for it. We now know it as an aurora, caused by solar particles hitting Earth's magnetic field. But in 1263, it was nothing short of a divine warning. Brother Ulrich gathered the monks in the chapel that night. Candles burned low. Psalms were chanted for protection. Some wept. Others confessed sins aloud, fearing the end of days. But Alaric simply watched. He had never seen anything like it. It didn't feel like judgment. It felt natural, beautiful, patterned. But patterns, in that time, could be dangerous. The next day, he was called into the prior's quarters. The room was plain. Wooden table, crucifix on the wall, a copy of Augustine's City of God. Ulrich motioned for him to sit. "You've been observed," he said, without anger. "Out at night, with stones, measuring shadows, watching the sky." He paused. "Do you believe the stars speak lies?" Alaric didn't answer, not because he was defiant, but because he wasn't sure. He hadn't found truth, only questions. And in the Middle Ages, questions could burn like heresy. Ulrich's gaze lingered. "The heavens declare the glory of God," he recited. "They are not to be measured, but revered." Then, softer, "Be careful what you chase, Alaric. The stars will not chase you back." That evening, Alaric returned to the scriptorium. Alone. He opened a hidden drawer beneath the writing bench and removed the parchment scrap. The passage from the old Roman text, the one that suggested movement. A world not fixed, and beside it, he placed a new scrap of his own, a diagram. But it showed something that no one in his world believed. The earth, not at the center. The sun, fixed. The planets, circling. He wasn't the first to imagine it, but he was imagining it alone, in a monastery, in a century not yet ready. Part 4. The Weight of Silence. The next few weeks passed quietly. The aurora faded. The monks returned to their routines. But something in Alaric did not. He continued his work, copying sermons, boiling ink, trimming parchment. But at night, the sky remained his teacher. He tracked Venus through its phases, noticing its brightness waning, then returning. He mapped the moon's arc against a carved post near the abbey wall. And more troublingly, he started writing in the margins. Not overtly, not enough to be noticed, but just enough to remember. Why does Mars move backward? Why do eclipses repeat every 18 cycles? What if the Earth is moving? He wasn't writing for anyone. He didn't expect discovery or fa. He was writing for one reason only, so that he wouldn't forget what it felt like to notice something no one else dared to. In the village nearby, a man had fallen ill. Then 2 more. The monks spoke of plague. Superstition returned with force. Some blamed the strange lights in the sky. Others blamed sin, pride, or foreign winds. One monk whispered that the sickness was a punishment, for prideful eyes lifted too high. Alaric heard this, and said nothing. But that night, he buried the diagram beneath the roots of an elm tree behind the orchard. He would not burn it, but he would not risk it either. He returned to his cell, lay flat on the straw mat, and watched the flicker of candlelight on the ceiling. And he thought, even if the world is moving, I am standing still. Winter came early. The wind through the stone walls of the abbey whispered like voices. Frost covered the glassless windows of the scriptorium by sunrise. The ink froze in the pots unless warmed by candle heat. But Alaric kept working. He was now copying a Latin edition of Genesis, line by line. Creation. In 6 days. The firmament, above. The waters, below. He didn't skip a word. But as he wrote, and God made 2 great lights, the greater, to rule the day. His eyes paused. He had seen the phases of Venus. He had seen the moon shadow move across the face of the sun. 2 lights, he thought, but what of the others? The ones that move, that disappear, and return. The monks called them wanderers. But wandering suggested purpose, and Alaric was beginning to believe the sky had no purpose at all. He had been trained under men who had access to translated Arabic manuscripts and even some forbidden Greek cosmologies. He spoke carefully, but with curiosity. In the dining hall, after evening prayers, Alaric approached him. "May I ask," he began, voice low, "do your scholars believe the earth is fixed?" Petrus paused mid-spoonful of broth. He glanced around, then lowered his voice. "Officially, yes, All things revolve around it. A beat. But not all of us are so certain. At night, the two spoke for hours under the cloister's arches. Whispers only. Not theories, just possibilities. Petrus spoke of men like Alhazen, who studied optics and the behavior of light. Of Copernicus, just a boy now in Poland, but born into a world that might change. Of the Greeks who once believed the earth spun slowly, quietly, unseen. Alaric didn't feel hope. He felt weight. Will these ideas ever be spoken aloud? Perhaps, Petrus said, or buried again, until a knot. Weeks passed. Petrus left. Snow covered the paths between abbey and field. Alaric did not speak of the stars again, but something in him would not still. One afternoon, beneath a heavy gray sky, he walked to the elm tree, the one near the orchard, where months ago he had buried his parchment. The soil was stiff, the parchment damp but still legible. The diagram had changed nothing. No one had seen it, no one would, but it was his. His quiet refusal. Later that evening, a fire broke out in the scriptorium. No lives were lost, but several shelves of texts were damaged. The monks called it a punishment. They prayed for days. Alaric said nothing, but stared long at the hole in the ceiling through which smoke had escaped. It pointed straight to the stars. His name was Tomas, a boy of perhaps 13, newly arrived from the lowland villages. Thin wrists, quiet voice, eyes that lingered too long on things others ignored. He was assigned to the scriptorium. His job, grind pigments, warm ink over flame, clean the brushes. Alaric noticed how he stared at the sky while walking between buildings. Not out of wonder, but out of habit. So, one evening, as they sat sorting parchment, Alaric asked softly, "What do you see when you look up?" Tomas shrugged, hesitant. "The moon, mostly. The red star sometimes moves." "Mars," Alaric said gently. "It appears to move backward." Tomas blinked. "How?" Alaric paused. The safe answer was, "Because God wills it." The true answer had no place in that room, but he gave it anyway. "Because perhaps we are moving too." The next week, Tomas returned with a question of his own. "If the sun doesn't rise, but we turn, why don't we feel it?" Alaric smiled faint. He showed Thomas how to use a plumb line to measure angles, how to note the sun's position at fixed times each day, how to mark the shortening days on the stone wall by the well. They spoke in quiet tones, always alone, always in questions, never in declarations. That was their safety. Winter deepened. By candlelight, Thomas copied a strange diagram under Alaric's guidance. A circle within a circle, smaller bodies spiraling outward, the sun in the middle. Not truth, just a theory, not a claim, only a drawing. Alaric wrapped it in waxed linen and placed it behind a loose stone in the dormitory wall. Not to spread, not to publish, just to exist. Outside the monastery, rumors swirled of growing tensions. The plague had returned in nearby cities. A comet had been seen, a burning line across the sky. Panic was rising again. The monks interpreted it as judgment, but Alaric and Thomas watched in silence. "They see a message," Alaric whispered. "We see a pattern." In the spring, a new bishop visited. He praised the abbey's discipline. He asked polite questions, and then he requested the review of all teaching materials, including any diagrams or unusual texts. Alaric felt the chill of something coming undone. He removed the parchment from the wall and burned it himself before anyone could find it. Thomas wept silently. Alaric said only, "Better it burn than you." Weeks passed. Thomas no longer asked questions aloud, but his gaze spoke for him. Alaric could see it in the way the boy would trace invisible lines in the dirt with a stick. or stacked stones in curved patterns near the herb garden. He was beginning to think in circles. The monastery had strict hours of silence now. Even meals were taken in quiet. Only the prior spoke, reading aloud from scripture while others ate. But Thomas and Alaric had found new ways to share ideas. A glance toward the rising moon. A faint gesture when a cloud passed over the sun. Chalk lines drawn on the back of discarded parchment, then quietly burned by nightfall. These were not protests, not revolts. They were exercises in noticing. One afternoon, Thomas brought Alaric a fragment of stone. It was smooth and dark, flat on one side. "It reflects," the boy whispered, "but only a little." Alaric turned it in his hand. It was obsidian, likely from a long-dead traveler's pouch. Rare here, but not impossible. They placed it on a flat table, and with a pinhole above it, observed how sunlight moved across its face, slowly, predictably. "The light changes," Thomas said, "but the motion is constant." That evening, Alaric added a quiet note in his personal journal, a codex he kept hidden in a hollowed-out Bible cover. Even in silence, discovery breathes. Summer came late that year. The fields near the abbey were slow to ripen. Insects swarmed the grain stores. One monk claimed he saw blood rain from the sky, though it was likely red dust carried from southern lands. Still, fear spread. A rumor began that someone in the monastery had drawn stars with no angels near them, that a boy had been heard asking why the sun turned when it should simply rise. It was small, but small rumors grow teeth in dark places. Alaric instructed Thomas to speak to no one unless spoken to nod politely, to return early from all tasks. "Your mind," he said, "is not theirs to borrow." Thomas obeyed, but he did not stop observing. One morning, after prayer, he whispered, "What if the stars don't move at all?" Alaric looked at him, not with pride, not fear, but recognition. The boy had crossed a threshold. He would never return. The monastery had grown quieter, not by rule, but by instinct. There was a sense that something was being watched, not by God, but by men. Brothers who once shared bread and stories at dusk now nodded without speaking. The candlelit halls that echoed with soft chant were still, except for the sound of parchment turning in the library. Thomas no longer asked questions, even in whispers. He had learned to observe in silence, a form of reverence, or perhaps self-preservation. He began charting the moon's rise using stones, flat ones from the garden. Each one nudged a little every evening. It formed a crescent ring over time. Imperfect, yes, but enough to see a pattern. Alaric noticed. "You're building a calendar," he said quietly one morning. Thomas nodded. "To know when it's the same night as before," he answered, "but under a different sky." Alaric didn't respond. He only turned back toward the chapel. But that night, he slipped Thomas an old scroll, thin, brittle, barely legible, written in Latin with diagrams of concentric spheres and notes in a trembling hand. "Spheres upon spheres," it read, each turning the one below. The geocentric model. Aristotle's great gift to the ages, still unchallenged here. But for Thomas, it raised more questions than it answered. That week, Thomas found an old warped lens, part of a damaged reliquary gifted by a noble years before. It wasn't much, but held to the eye, it shifted the world, ever so slightly. He began using it to watch the stars, or rather, their tremble, and he noticed. not all stars stayed fixed. One in particular, faint, red, slightly erratic. A wanderer, he whispered. It doesn't obey the dome. It was Mars. He did not know its name, but he knew its defiance. He sketched its arc on spare parchment, line by line, night after night, each one an act of quiet heresy. Meanwhile, the monastery had grown suspicious. A novice had discovered strange markings behind the chapel's wall panels. Others whispered about shadows that move without sun. It was nonsense, mostly, fear feeding on itself. But Alaric had seen this before. Long ago, in another town, where a man too curious had been accused of summoning storms with his gaze. That man had burned, so Alaric made a choice. He gathered Tomas's papers, the star maps, the shadow diagrams, even the notes about the moon, and one night, by lantern light, he placed them into a small satchel. He handed them to Tomas at the garden's edge. "Take the donkey trail east," he said. "There's an abbey 3 days from here that trades in glass and ink. Ask for Brother Leon." Tomas looked confused, frustrated. "But I was so close," he whispered. "So close to seeing how it all fits." Alaric placed a hand on his shoulder. "You still can," he said, "but not here." Tomas left before sunrise. The satchel was light. Just a few scrolls, the broken lens, some bread wrapped in cloth. The road was rough and unpaved. A thin trail through dew-covered grass and low fog. He passed no one, only the crows, watching from trees without leaves, and the echo of bells from the monastery, already fading behind him. For the first time in months, he could think without whispering, and in that silence, the sky felt larger. 3 nights later, he reached the Abbey of St. Leon, tucked between hills and barely more than a stone rectangle with a red clay roof. They welcomed him as a traveler, not a scholar. He didn't correct them. Inside, a small scriptorium smelled of vinegar and lamp oil. A few monks copied texts with tired eyes. One of them, a thin, tall man, looked up. "You were sent by Alaric," he said. "I remember his letters." This was Brother Leon. Older than Thomas had expected, but sharp-eyed, he invited Thomas to sit. Thomas unrolled the scrolls. Leon studied the lines, the moon phases, the path of the wanderer star, the shadow circles drawn beneath a window frame. And then, he smiled. "You've seen more than most of us are allowed to know," he said, almost kindly. Over the following weeks, Thomas stayed in a storeroom beside the chapel. Not a cell of punishment, but a room where he could read, copy, and think. Leon gave him access to the small collection of translated texts, fragments of Arabic astronomy, Jewish calendrical charts, and 2 damaged Greek commentaries on Ptolemaic spheres. And from these, Thomas began to realize the stars did move, but not as a solid dome. They spun each on their own layer, spheres within spheres, each one transparent, like glass. The earth was still at the center, of course, but something inside him cracked just slightly. "What if," he whispered one night, "what if we are not the center, but only appear to be?" He didn't speak it aloud, not yet. The penalty for such thinking, even in the safest places, was exile or worse. But he kept watching Mars, kept noting the retrograde loop it made across the winter sky, a backward wiggle, impossible to explain with F. He traced the path again and again. This motion, it's like we're moving too. But again, he said nothing, only wrote, and thought, and breathed. Months passed, spring returned, the air warmed, the monastery garden bloomed in quiet patterns. Leon taught Tomas how to grind a new lens. They used polished sand and goat hide, pressed slow and steady across glass circles no bigger than a coin. And with those lenses, they built a simple tube, a spyglass, crude and narrow. But when pointed at the moon, Tomas gasped, "It's not smooth." Indeed, the surface was rough. Craters, lines, ridges. The heavens, once believed to be perfect and unblemished, now looked much like Earth. Rough, scarred, real. That night he wrote, "If the moon is like Earth, perhaps the heavens are not above us, but around us and within us." He never published it, but the manuscript survived. Hidden between the pages of a religious calendar, later smuggled across mountains, copied by another monk who never wrote his name. And in time, years, decades later, it reached the hands of a man in Italy who would later teach a boy named Galileo. Part 16. Silence, Light and Memory. Tomas died quietly in the Abbey of St. Leon. His grave was marked only by a stone and a single word, Viator, the traveler. No one remembered his face, but his questions, those soft, patient questions, whispered into candlelight, traveled much farther than he ever did. And long after the towers fell, long after the monasteries were emptied, his words remained. Not because they were loud, but because they were true. And that, dear listener, was the story not of a hero, but of a man who asked questions in a world that punished them. Thank you for staying. If you're still with us, perhaps you've already drifted a bit, or maybe you're wide awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the stars and whether they move or whether we do. Either way, leave a comment telling us where you're listening from, what time it is, and whether you believe the sky above is still or alive. Don't forget to subscribe, and we'll see you again in another time, in another quiet corner of the past. Good night.